What if I told you that behind these walls, a doctor turned hotel rooms into death traps, and sold his victims' skeletons to medical schools? What if this was no fictional story, but a horrifying truth from America's past? A man who would lure his victims in never to be seen again, and leave behind nothing but terror. This is not a story of ghosts or myths. This is the chilling reality of Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, America's first serial killer, and the unspeakable horrors that took place inside his murder castle. If you're intrigued by true crime and the horrors of history, subscribe now and turn on your notification bell icon. This chilling story is just the beginning. Don't miss what comes next. Tonight, you'll be taken deep into the disturbing life of Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, a man once seen as a successful physician and respectable businessman, who behind closed doors orchestrated one of the most horrifying chapters in American history, through clever cons, medical school scams, and a labyrinthine building filled with hidden rooms, trapdoors, soundproof walls, gas lines, and acid vats. He transformed his so-called hotel into a custom-designed house of death where countless victims vanished without a trace. This is not fiction. This is the true story of the doctor who sold skeletons and built a murder castle in the heart of Chicago. Before the nation ever heard the name HH Holmes, before the screams were swallowed by the walls of his nightmarish castle, there was a boy named Herman Webster Mudgett. He was born on May 16, 1861 in the town of Gilmanton, New Hampshire, a place where families lived modestly, church bells rang on Sundays and everyone knew each other's names. But behind the white picket fences and dirt roads, inside a modest family home, a far more troubling story was beginning to unfold. Young Herman was no ordinary child. While most boys his age were playing with friends or helping on the farm, Herman was already hiding dark secrets. He was unusually withdrawn, eerily calm, and coldly calculating. Some said he had the charm of a preacher but the stare of a predator. He was clever, disturbingly so, and that intelligence, combined with his ability to manipulate and deceive, would soon make him dangerous. Those who knew him as a boy later whispered of disturbing signs, how he was seen dissecting animals with surgical precision, how he seemed fascinated not just by death but by control. There were rumors, never proven, that he lured a classmate into an abandoned house and frightened him nearly to death by locking him in a closet with a skeleton. It was during this time that he began to understand something. Fear was a kind of power. And Herman Mudgett wanted power more than anything else. He pursued higher education and studied medicine at the University of Michigan, where he was academically brilliant but ethically bankrupt. It was there that he first discovered how useful the dead could be. Holmes, still Mudgett at the time, stole corpses from the school's medical labs, bodies of unclaimed patients or the forgotten poor, and used them in elaborate insurance fraud schemes. He would burn or disfigure the corpses beyond recognition, pass them off as victims of tragic accidents, and collect large life insurance payouts. He didn't just fake death, he profited from it again and again. These weren't spur-of-the-moment cons. They were carefully orchestrated trials of deceit, wrapped in just enough truth to evade suspicion. But even that wasn't enough. Eventually his past began to catch up to him. Whispers of suspicion, unpaid debts, and inconsistencies in his stories forced him to flee from town to town. And so, in one of the most chilling transformations in American crime history, Herman Webster Mudgett vanished, and in his place rose a new man. He became Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. The name alone inspired trust. It sounded elegant, professional, safe. And with that new name came a new identity. He reinvented himself as a doctor, a chemist, a pharmacist, a landlord, and a businessman, whatever the situation required. He was everything and nothing at once, blending in wherever he went. He knew how to smile without meaning it, how to look someone in the eyes while imagining their murder. He had built a mask so perfect, no one thought to look behind it. With this new identity, Holmes eventually made his way to Chicago, a growing city pulsing with opportunity, money, and anonymity. There, amid the chaos of the 1893 World's Fair, he would find the perfect hunting ground. Thousands arrived daily with hopes of a better life, and many would never be seen again. Chicago didn't know it yet, but death had already taken up residence, and it was wearing a doctor's coat. Do you believe serial killers like Holmes are born with darkness in their blood, or shaped by their environment and choices? Let me know what you think in the comments below. He began quietly, finding work at a small neighborhood pharmacy at the corner of South Wallace Avenue and 63rd Street, in the working-class neighborhood of Englewood. He introduced himself as a doctor, a professional. He helped elderly customers, offered mothers remedies for their children's coughs, and rarely if ever raised suspicion. The drugstore's elderly owner vanished soon after Holmes arrived, his disappearance never solved. Holmes claimed he had passed away peacefully. When the man's wife inherited the store, Holmes charmed her too, and within a short time she also disappeared. He explained that she had moved to California. No questions were asked. No police were involved. He took over the business entirely. And so, with 2 people missing and a store now under his name, the next chapter began. It was the vacant lot just behind the pharmacy that captured Holmes's attention. There, he envisioned something that had never been built before. A structure not designed to heal, house, or help, but to lure, trap, and extinguish. He called it a hotel. He called it a business opportunity. But it would later be known as one of the most horrifying structures in American criminal history, the murder castle. Construction began under false pretenses. Holmes, as calculating as ever, made sure no one but himself ever saw the full blueprint. He hired workers by the dozen, then fired them just as quickly. Carpenters, bricklayers, plumbers, and engineers came and went. When one asked too many questions about a sealed door that led to nowhere, they were dismissed. When another inquired why certain rooms lacked windows or ventilation, they were replaced. In time, no single person had a clear view of what they were really building. Each piece of the castle was a lie stitched to another lie, and Holmes was the only one who understood the full architecture of horror. On the surface, it appeared to be a perfectly ordinary 3-story building. Retail stores and a pharmacy on the first floor, modest apartments and rooms for rent above. It was the perfect ruse, especially with the 1893 World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition, approaching fast. Tens of thousands of people were arriving from across the nation and overseas. Chicago had never been more alive. But for Holmes, the World's Fair wasn't just a celebration of progress. It was a buffet of victims. Inside the castle, things were not as they seemed. The second and third floors were a labyrinth, an architectural nightmare designed with murderous intent. There were staircases that led to brick walls. Doors that opened to sheer drops. Windows placed between rooms so Holmes could watch his victims. There were hallways designed to confuse. Some were long and narrow, others abruptly ended. There were false walls, hinged panels, peepholes, and hidden compartments. Entire rooms were lined with asbestos and iron, airtight, built to trap screams. Holmes had outfitted them with gas lines that he could control from behind the walls. A guest would check in for the night, and wake up coughing, panicking, choking, locked inside with no way out as gas filled their lungs and darkness took over. Some rooms had metal restraints mounted to the walls. Others were soundproofed and bolted shut. Holmes would watch. He would listen. And when it was done, when they had stopped screaming, he would open the trapdoor beneath their lifeless body, and it would fall, down a greased chute, into the basement. But it was the basement that housed his true madness. There Holmes had assembled his own private morgue. Large vats of quicklime waited to strip away flesh. A surgical table stood under a bright lamp. A rack for stretching bodies. A pit filled with acid. And in the corner, quietly smoldering at all hours, was a brick furnace, disguised as a simple incinerator. It was here, in this underground chamber, where the bodies disappeared forever. Their identities erased. Their families left with only silence. But not all were destroyed. Holmes had studied anatomy. He had learned how to articulate bones, how to clean them. And he knew that medical schools paid handsomely for fresh skeletons. So he became a supplier. He peeled away flesh, boiled bodies, bleached bones. He took young women, hopeful job seekers and tourists, and turned them into profit, selling their skeletons to universities under the table. What medical students believed were anonymous remains from distant lands were, in fact, girls who had vanished just weeks before from Chicago's streets. And yet, through it all, Holmes continued to operate in plain sight. He walked calmly through his pharmacy, gave candy to children, offered medical advice to worried parents. He was handsome, composed, and articulate. His victims trusted him. The police didn't suspect him. Businessmen partnered with him. Landlords rented to him. In a city bursting with optimism, his darkness was invisible. As the World's Fair reached its peak, Holmes opened his so-called World's Fair Hotel. Travelers came and went. Some checked in and never checked out. They were written off as runaways, as lost in the crowds, as women who had simply changed their minds and disappeared into a new life. The reality was much worse. Holmes was killing freely, and he had created a machine to do it. And yet, despite the strange disappearances, the whispers, and the growing unease, no one ever suspected the man in the clean white coat, standing behind the pharmacy counter with a soft voice and a pleasant smile. He was the doctor, the businessman, the neighbor. But behind that smile, behind that castle, was a nightmare waiting to be uncovered. He began by using charm and psychological manipulation, targeting women, mostly young, single and far from home, offering them respectable employment in his pharmacy or lodging in his boarding rooms. They trusted him. After all, he was a doctor. Well-dressed, polite and educated. What they didn't know was that the very rooms he offered them were rigged, some sealed tight with soundproof insulation, others piped with gas lines hidden behind the walls, ready to suffocate his victims at the turn of a valve. Once he had murdered them, through asphyxiation, starvation or chemical means, Holmes didn't simply dispose of the bodies. He harvested them. With a surgeon's precision, he would strip the flesh, clean the bones and reassemble full skeletons. These weren't just trophies. They were products, sold to medical schools and anatomical laboratories across the country. And with forged credentials and medical connections, no one questioned the source of these specimens. He was selling death as science. Holmes understood the value of a corpse better than most. But he also knew how to turn life into profit. He routinely took out life insurance policies on his victims, often forging documents and using fake identities. Once they were dead, he cashed in, collecting payouts on people the insurance companies believed were still alive or had died in accidents. His knowledge of human anatomy, combined with his intimate familiarity with medical institutions and funeral practices, allowed him to falsify causes of death and plant just enough doubt to avoid suspicion. And he didn't work alone. There are documented reports that Holmes had connections to university faculty and corrupt medical examiners who helped cover up his crimes, making them appear as natural deaths or disappearances. Perhaps the most chilling revelation came decades later, when former students and doctors alike began to realize that the full skeletons they had studied during their early medical training might not have come from anonymous cadavers donated to science, but from the murder castle itself. It's a disturbing possibility that some of the bones labeled for education were actually the remains of women who thought they were beginning a new chapter in their lives in the great city of Chicago, only to meet an unthinkable end in a maze of death designed by a man who wore the mask of civility over the face of a killer. And so, as we piece together the extent of Holmes' schemes, his manipulation of science, insurance, trust, and even death itself, we're left to wonder, how many skeletons were sold? How many schools unknowingly financed the crimes of HH Holmes? And how many victims were lost not just in body but in name, their remains scrubbed clean and boxed up for classrooms, never to be claimed, never to be mourned? And now we reach the part of this dark journey that is hardest to speak, yet the most important to remember, the people. The lives behind the headlines. The victims of HH Holmes were not nameless statistics. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, friends. They had favorite songs, shared secrets and letters, smiled in photographs we'll never see. Their footsteps once echoed in homes and cities, until the moment they vanished into the twisted blueprint of Holmes' monstrous design. Let us begin with Julia Connor, who once worked at Holmes' pharmacy and became entangled with him personally and romantically. When her husband, Ned Connor, grew suspicious and ultimately left, Julia and her daughter, Pearl, stayed behind. She believed she had found security with Holmes, but instead she disappeared shortly thereafter. Holmes would later admit, in chilling confessions, that he had killed Julia during an abortion attempt gone wrong. An accident, he claimed. But there is no evidence to support that it was anything other than premeditated murder. And Pearl? A bright-eyed young girl, full of life and trust. She too was never seen again. Imagine it, a mother and daughter erased, their futures stolen by a man who claimed to care for them. Then there was Emmeline Sigrand, a former secretary who had once worked at Keeley Institute, an alcohol treatment facility. She was described by those who knew her as intelligent and kind, a woman who carried herself with grace. Holmes hired her to work in his building, offering her a promising future and, by some accounts, proposing marriage. Her family grew suspicious when the letters stopped coming. They never heard from her again. Her disappearance was swallowed by the castle's soundproof rooms and false walls. Next were the Williams sisters, Minnie and Nanny, two young women from Texas. Minnie was educated and artistic, inheriting a sizable fortune after the death of her wealthy uncle. Holmes, under a false name, convinced her to transfer property rights to him, promising marriage, a life together, a future. Nanny came to Chicago soon after, likely to meet the man her sister had become involved with. Within days of her arrival, they both vanished. Two young women, full of dreams and bound by blood, lured to Chicago by love and trust, and never seen again. But no act of cruelty from Holmes compares to what he did to the Pittazel family. Benjamin Pittazel wasn't just a partner in fraud. He was a father, a husband, and a man with a struggling but hopeful family. Holmes promised him a quick payout in a staged insurance scam. But Holmes killed Benjamin for real, burning his body and mutilating it to avoid identification. Then, and this is where the story descends into unimaginable horror, Holmes convinced Benjamin's widow, Carrie Pitzel, to let him take 3 of her children across the country under the pretense of reuniting them with their father. Holmes traveled with Alice, Nellie, and Howard, staying in different cities under different names. He kept them alive for a while, moving from one hotel to the next. Then one by one he killed them. Alice and Nellie, aged 14 and 11, were found buried in a Toronto basement. They had been gassed and forced into trunks. Their bodies were discovered with their faces turned toward each other, as though they died in fear, or perhaps clinging to one another. Howard, just 8 years old, was murdered in Indianapolis. Holmes dismembered him and tried to destroy the evidence in a stove. And through all of this, Carrie Pitzel had no idea. She believed Holmes' updates that her children were safe, perhaps even excited to see their father soon. Imagine her grief when she learned the truth. And yet, these are just the confirmed names. Only 9 in total, though Holmes himself hinted at more than 27, and some investigators believe the number could be closer to 200. Countless women came to Chicago during the 1893 World's Fair looking for work, opportunity, or simply a place to stay. Many were last seen entering Holmes' castle, and never seen again. Their lives were not footnotes to history, they were the heartbeats that stopped too soon, the voices silenced by greed, manipulation, and cruelty. In a world so fascinated by monsters, we must remember the names of those who stood no chance against him. By 1894, the elaborate house of cards Henry Howard Holmes had constructed, layer by layer, lie by lie, began to teeter. And though the walls of his infamous murder castle had hidden unspeakable horrors for years, it wasn't the bloodshed or missing women that initially drew the law's attention. No, ironically it was paperwork. Holmes' downfall began not with screams but signatures. He was arrested in Boston for something far less theatrical than murder: insurance fraud. A scheme involving a policy taken out on Benjamin Pitzel, the man he'd burned alive and left in a shallow grave. Holmes claimed the body was someone else's, an anonymous victim substituted to fake Pitzel's death. But the charade unraveled quickly. Detectives, led by the dogged and brilliant detective Frank Geyer, were already suspicious. And once they began to peel back the layers, they didn't find just fraud, they found rot. The investigation that followed crossed state lines. Geyer retraced Holmes' steps with chilling precision, uncovering boarding houses, abandoned apartments, and rented properties in city after city. The goal? To locate the missing Pitzel children. It was a race against time, until it wasn't, because time had already run out. Alice and Nellie were discovered buried beneath a Toronto basement floor, packed into a shallow grave and partially decomposed. Howard was found next in Indianapolis. His remains had been burned in a stove, small bones, charred teeth, and bits of cloth, all that remained of a young boy with no reason to die. And as Geyer pursued justice across state lines, investigators turned their attention back to the ominous structure looming on the corner of 63rd and Wallace in Chicago. Holmes' 3-story labyrinth, now known infamously as the Murder Castle. What they found inside remains one of the most disturbing discoveries in American criminal history. The walls whispered secrets, literally. Hollow spaces echoed when tapped. Hidden passageways snaked through the structure like veins through flesh. Soundproof rooms had bolts on the outside. Gas lines ran behind walls and into sealed chambers. There were trapdoors, staircases that led nowhere, and chutes that dropped straight into the basement, into the dark heart of the building where the real work had been done. That basement became a chamber of evidence. Bones, blood-soaked clothing, a woman's footprint etched in tar, and surgical tools no longer used for healing. Acid vats, quicklime pits, and a crematorium sat in grotesque stillness. Every step deeper into the castle was a step further into the mind of a man who didn't just kill. He engineered murder. He designed a factory of death. By the time the trial began, the public was ravenous. Newspapers dubbed Holmes everything from a modern Bluebeard to the devil incarnate. Crowds packed courtrooms and newsboys shouted his name on every street corner. But Holmes remained calm, confident, even charismatic. He represented himself in court as if the entire thing were just another clever game. The focus of the trial became the Pitzel murders, which the prosecution could prove with damning evidence. The testimony was gut-wrenching. Of children locked away in trunks, of a mother deceived into letting her children vanish, of a man too trusting of a devil in human skin. Then came the confessions. Holmes eventually admitted to 27 murders. The number shocked the public, but what made it even more disturbing was that some of the people he claimed to have killed were later found alive. This raised a terrifying question. How many of his confessions were true, and how many deaths had he actually hidden? If he confessed to crimes he didn't commit, was it because he'd lost touch with truth entirely? Or was it yet another manipulation, a final power move in his lifelong game of deceit? During sentencing, Holmes didn't beg. He didn't weep. In fact, he said this: "I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than a poet can help the inspiration to sing." It was a statement that chilled the courtroom. Because Holmes wasn't just admitting guilt, he was embracing it. As though murder wasn't a decision but a calling. He was sentenced to death by hanging. On the morning of May 7, 1896, as dawn broke over the grim landscape of Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia, the air was thick with the anticipation of justice being served, a justice long overdue. The man who had once walked the streets of Chicago under the guise of a charming doctor, a man who'd carefully crafted an empire of death, was finally about to face the consequences of his gruesome deeds. Henry Howard Holmes, whose life had been one of deception, cruelty, and unthinkable horrors, stood on the gallows, poised to meet his end. His demeanor was unnerving, a man who, despite the enormity of his crimes, showed no visible fear. In fact, he appeared eerily calm, his face betraying no remorse or desperation. He walked to his death as if it were just another performance in a series of elaborate cons, utterly unfazed by the moment. Some whispered that perhaps, for Holmes, death was the ultimate trick, the final illusion he had pulled off with cold precision. But before the trapdoor would fall and his fate sealed, Holmes made a peculiar, almost haunting request. He insisted, almost obsessively, that his coffin be sealed in cement and buried 10 feet underground, a measure designed to ensure that no one could ever tamper with his body. It was a strange but revealing request. He who had once sold human bodies like commodities, was now desperate to prevent anyone from doing the same to him. Perhaps it was his final, twisted effort to control his fate, to defy the very thing that had consumed the lives of so many others, that being the exploitation of their bodies for profit. His obsession with secrecy and evasion had followed him even to the grave. As the trapdoor opened beneath him, the world watched in grim silence, knowing this moment would finally mark the end of Holmes' reign of terror. But justice did not come swiftly. As Holmes' body dropped, his neck did not snap as expected. Instead, he struggled in agony, writhing for what felt like an eternity, his body convulsing, his feet scraping the floor, and his face turning a deep, dark purple, evidence of the slow suffocation he endured. It took nearly 15 minutes for him to die, a slow, drawn-out end that seemed almost too fitting for the man whose legacy had been one of drawn-out suffering for his victims. Observers later remarked on how unnervingly still his body became, as though it had been overtaken by an unnatural calm after a final desperate battle for life. It was almost as if, despite everything, Holmes' soul wasn't quite ready to let go, his final moments stretching the line between life and death. And as the crowd dispersed, there were murmurs that perhaps this wasn't the end of Holmes, the end of his story, but rather the beginning of something much darker, a legend that would live on in whispers for years to come. Some began to ask the unsettling question: was it truly over? Was the man who had so thoroughly deceived everyone around him capable of pulling off one final, catastrophic con? Rumors swirled that Holmes had faked his death, that the body buried wasn't his, that somehow he had pulled one final con. In fact, in 2017, over 120 years later, his grave was exhumed. DNA tests were performed. And only then did the world confirm: yes, the body was Holmes. The devil was dead. As the world moved on from the death of Dr. HH Holmes, a shadow seemed to linger over the very ground that had once supported his murder castle, the place where so many lives were stolen, where the whispers of the dead never truly seemed to fade. The building, a testament to Holmes' terrifying genius for manipulation and death, stood eerily silent for only a short time after his execution. But soon, fate, or perhaps something more sinister, would ensure that it never became a lasting reminder of his reign of terror. In 1895, just a year after Holmes' execution, a mysterious fire swept through the building, consuming its dark history in an inferno that seemed almost too symbolic to be coincidental. The flames tore through the structure, razing what had been the embodiment of evil, leaving only a smoldering pile of ash and rubble in its wake. Some say the fire was a natural disaster, an accident that couldn't be avoided, but others whispered that the castle's curse had finally come to fruition, that the vengeful spirits of the women, men, and children who had perished inside those walls had risen and set the building aflame, ensuring that no trace of Holmes' horrors would remain. It was a moment that seemed almost as twisted as the story of the man himself, an end that echoed the horror that had occurred behind the walls of the building. After the fire, the land remained a source of fascination and fear. People who lived nearby reported feeling uneasy when passing the site, and locals spoke in hushed tones about the cursed nature of the land, as if simply walking over it might invite doom or even death. And yet, time marched on as it always does. In an eerie twist, the site of the infamous murder castle was ultimately transformed into something seemingly ordinary, something so banal, so prosaic, it felt almost mocking in the face of the history that had unfolded there. In 1938, a U.S. post office was built on the very ground where so many innocent lives were extinguished. The irony was not lost on those who remembered the tales. The transformation of a place of unspeakable horrors into a mundane part of everyday life seemed almost too much to bear. But even as the decades passed and the ghosts of Holmes' victims seemed to slip into the fog of history, something dark still clung to that patch of land. Paranormal investigators, intrigued by the tragic past of the site, began to claim that the murder castle's ghostly legacy had not been erased. Reports surfaced of strange occurrences, unexplained footsteps echoing in the empty halls, flickering lights when no one was around, and even sightings of shadowy figures in the corners of the building. Some swore they saw figures standing at the windows, gazing out into the street, their faces twisted in anguish. Disembodied voices were said to whisper in the dark corners of the post office, as if the spirits of the murdered still lingered there, unable to rest in peace. A team of paranormal researchers conducted investigations, claiming to have captured evidence of the supernatural. Recordings of ghostly moans, images of faint shapes, and video footage of doors slamming shut on their own raised the chilling question. Was Holmes' legacy so powerful that it had imbued the very land with a dark energy that refused to leave? Or was it simply the weight of the atrocities committed there that made it impossible for anyone to forget? No one could say for sure. But the idea that the souls of Holmes' victims might still haunt the place where they met their end became an unsettling thought for those who ventured too close. If this story sent chills down your spine, smash that like button. Which part of the Holmes story creeped you out the most? Tell me in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell icon for more uploads.